My sermon for this morning is a little bit unique. It's unique in the fact that the first time that I preached this sermon was to an empty sanctuary during the month of August while my colleague pastor was on vacation. Here we are again. The first time I preached this sermon was on August 13th, 2017. The sanctuary was empty because the streets were still closed around First United Methodist Church because the day before was the Unite the Right rally that happened in the park across the street. The senior pastor at the time was on leave, and I, 1 year into ministry, was the only appointed clergy person nearby. And this sermon, I'm sharing it with you today because here we are 3 years later. Again, the month of August. My co-pastor is on leave. I'm the lone appointed pastor. The sanctuaries are again empty for completely different reasons. But since the lectionary is on a 3-year cycle, this text comes to us again. And knowing that we're separated by COVID-19 and the coronavirus, I've been having some time to reflect on things that have happened in the past and things that might still happen in the future. I've been reflecting on the role of the church, how we address racial injustice, and our own part, specifically as the church, in doing that very necessary work. So I share this sermon with you today and invite you to go back in your mind. Where were you on August 13th, 2017, as this city was torn apart by a coordinated terrorist attack? What were your thoughts when you saw those images of hatred and wickedness on your screens? What caused them? How did you feel about that? How have your feelings changed over the last 3 years? And how do you feel about the role of the church in the midst of all of that chaos? I'm going to read this sermon and share it with you exactly as it was written for that Sunday. And so it was preached to the empty sanctuary of First United Methodist Church, save for a few people who were managed to make their way through the barricades. And as I look at this text, I want you to be asking yourself, and I want to encourage you to be thinking about, who is Jesus? Where is Jesus? And what is Jesus doing and why? We're looking today at Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Verse 22. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. Immediately. Whatever God has planned is on a timetable. Something is happening that requires Jesus to stress the urgency of the situation. This event is chronicled in other Gospels, so we can look there too for answers as to why this is happening so suddenly. The Gospel of John says that looking at this mass of people, Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king. In other words, the miracle of multiplying the loaves and the fishes, the 5,000 people gathered that we've read about and heard preached on many times before, has put the crowd into a frenzy. And so Jesus needs to execute some kind of escape plan. As long as Jesus was present with his apostles, the crowd knew that something miraculous was possible. So by putting the disciples into the boat, Jesus was saying to the people gathered, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. The show's over, there's no encore, and no, we are not serving dessert. Note too that it says Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. There is no mention of an additional boat to bring Jesus to them later on. Where were they going? Just to the other side of the lake? What was this about? It is doubtful that the disciples wanted to leave Jesus alone with the full force of 5,000 people milling about. But who is Jesus? What is Jesus doing and why? Verse 23. After he dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. Perhaps with some parting words of caution, counsel, and comfort, which might hold them over until their next meal, Jesus was able to abate the crowd. And he withdrew to the top of the mountain to chat with his Father. Remember, the servants of Christ have been set adrift and set out to sea, and Jesus goes off up alone to pray. Now, it's never really made clear how these mountaintop conversations go, but it's safe to assume that God does not screen calls from God's only Son. So the Son and the Father went to speak and talk. The end of verse 23 into 24. When evening came, Jesus was up there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from land, and the wind was against them. When evening came. If you have your Bibles and you glance back up to verse 15 in this same chapter, you'll see it was already evening when they were feeding people. So we've gone from dinner evening to evening. It's like the news is over and the late night hosts are now delivering their monologues type of evening. It's evening. Jesus is alone. As we all know, not really alone because he's Jesus. But we, the omniscient readers of this text, are redirected now to the scene playing out on the boat. The boat that was cast out on the water. Time has elapsed. Jesus praying, the disciples doing only God knows what for these past 6 hours or so. But here they are, and a storm is now raging. Battered by the waves and far from land. Perhaps their initial plan was to kind of hang out along the shoreline to keep an eye out for Jesus. But oh no, they are far from the land and the wind is against them. But remember, there are sailors on that boat. Experienced hands at the mast of a sailing vessel who are sailing on the Sea of Galilee. These are familiar waters. This was their home turf. This was their town, their streets. They followed their fathers into the water from the moment when they could walk. This should not have been an issue for them. But this is recounted to us in this way to specifically demonstrate the extreme situation that the disciples were in. Observe here. Things were confusing at the beginning. Jesus, the boat, the crowd, and gone. But then, after that, things got worse. We too set out in fair weather and calm waters, but may meet many storms before we arrive at port. The disciples were doing as Christ had told them. They were made to do something they probably didn't really want to do to begin with. And now here they are in a dire situation. Even the most experienced among them were unable to handle it. And so hear me, my friends. It is not uncommon for the followers of Jesus Christ to be sent out into the streets, out to sea, when their master foresees a storm. It is not uncommon for the servants of Christ to feel set adrift, caught up in the chaos and violence of circumstances that are beyond anything they can control. But our God is God over the storm. It is not uncommon for God to create situations that will allow God to reveal the glory, the wonder, the majesty, and the overwhelming nature of God's deep and abiding love. When we need to be redirected, corrected, or set on a new path, God may indeed whip up a storm and stir things up a little bit. Earlier in this chronological story of Jesus back in Matthew chapter 8, the disciples had been in a boat just like this. Jesus was asleep at the front for that story. But in this moment, they are alone. From their past experiences, they knew that if Christ were here, he would need to only speak into the wind and the waves, and all would be calm. They knew that if Jesus had gotten into the boat with them, his voice could have risen up over the crashing waves. Peace, be still. Because the voice that quiets the storm is the same voice that spoke the clouds and the wind and the rain into existence. They know that if Christ were with them, they would have nothing to fear. And so in their eyes, Jesus has abandoned them. And without the physical presence of Jesus, they fear they are lost. They think they are going to die, all because they listened to Jesus and they got in that boat. And so there they are. The rain and the wind and the waves pushing them to their physical and emotional limitations, and this binding fear, this immobilizing terror goes on for hours. And so there we were. The flags and the bats and the wooden shields, the guns and the taste of tear gas driving us back indoors. The full day of caring for the traumatized and bleeding people who came streaming to this church for treatment and counseling, pushing not only those of us who were here, but the other countless medical volunteers and people of faith, all to our physical and emotional limitations. And this binding fear, this untenable and indefensible terror, went on for hours. Who is Jesus? Where is Jesus? What is Jesus doing? And why? Verse 25. And early in the morning, he came walking towards them on the sea. Hours later, Jesus comes to them walking on the sea. What do we do with that? In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, he was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being." Jesus said, "I made this lake, and I will walk all over it if I want to." Because Jesus Christ is the Lord of all creation and has sovereign dominion over all creation, and everything that is, that was, or will be takes its rightful place beneath the feet of our crucified Lord. Verses 26 and 27, "But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, 'It is a ghost!' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them." Immediately. Again, Jesus does not waste time. Immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Tired, scared, abandoned, and lost, feeling betrayed, hopeless, and confused, caught up in a moment of chaos, fear, uncertainty, and confusion, the disciples have forgotten what Jesus looks like. Through the violence of this storm, Christ is not easily recognizable. When things have gotten too far out of hand and the rain is pounding and the waves are high, where is Jesus? What is Jesus doing and why? When the sounds of drums, the blades of helicopters, and the shouts of anger, fear, oppression, and they all inundate your senses when people are crying, bleeding, and shaking, where is Jesus? What is Jesus doing and why? Good people Christians, even the disciples, they can all exhibit a perplexing and even disquieting fear that arises from mistakes and misapprehensions in their knowledge and understanding of who Christ is. The 9th Psalm says, "And those who know your name put their trust in you, for you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you." The disciples don't see Jesus because they're not looking for Jesus. They can't tell Jesus from a water demon, an evil spirit, or a ghost who they think maybe has caused this storm. And I will confess, too, that in moments of fear and confusion, I have also mislabeled Christ. There will be people who talk about what happened yesterday in a way that demonstrates that they, like the disciples, they don't yet understand who Jesus is. They will speak of yesterday's horrors in a way that mislabels who Jesus is, where Jesus was, and what Jesus was doing. But hear me now, church. As we see here on the water, and as I can witness to from yesterday, our God is not only a God over the storm, but also a God in the storm. And this is clarified and demonstrated by how Jesus reacts to the disciples' undue concern. Look again, not at what was said exactly, but first as what was not said. Jesus does not really identify himself as Jesus. He doesn't say, "Hey, it's me, Jesus." He simply says, "It is I. Fear not. My sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. It is I." Back in Exodus chapter 3, Moses was talking to God and said, "If I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" And God says to Moses, "I am who I am. You shall say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent you.'" When Jesus walks out across the water, walking on his lake, clearly demonstrating his command and sovereignty over all creation, and revealing to himself to the disciples simply by saying, "It is I." That should have resonated with them in a pretty big way, but it doesn't. At least not yet. Verse 28, Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Peter, the rock of the church, hearing Jesus say, "It is I, fear not," responds with both uncertainty and yet overwhelming courage. But again, take note here of what is not said. Peter doesn't say, "Lord, if it's you, stop this storm." Peter doesn't say, "Lord, if it's you, why did you do this to us?" He doesn't say, "Lord, if it's you, where the heck have you been?" Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Command me to come to you. Never has the mission of the church been so clearly condensed into 6 words. Command me to come to you. In this moment, at the peak of exhaustion from fear and keeping the boat afloat all night, because remember, Simon Peter was a fisherman, often the de facto leader of the group, and so he probably would have been at the helm all night. After countless hours of avoiding death in this storm, Peter begins to understand who Jesus is. and in affirmation of Peter's intentionality and desire to understand, our incarnate God speaks, "Come." At this point, it's not about what isn't said, but it's more about what doesn't need to be said. I'm going to say it anyways, just so we're all on the same page. Jesus says, "Come. Come to me out on the water. Come to me where the waves are high and the water is deep and cold. Come to me in the wind and the rain, Peter. Come stand where I stand. Come do what I do. Come walk where I walk and stand with me in the middle of this storm." Yesterday, on August 12, 2017, Jesus said, "Come. Come to me in the streets. Come to me where the gas stings your lungs. Come to me where people are bleeding. Come to me where the voices of white supremacy and fascism and hate fill the air. Come to me where they carry torches. Come to me where your children are lining the streets with bats and shields and guns. Come to me where cars plow through crowds of pedestrians. Come stand where I stand. Come do what I do. Come walk where I walk and stand with me in the middle of this storm, because wherever two or more of you are gathered, I will be there. And today of all days in this city, I need to be everywhere. Jesus said, "Come." Verse 29. So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. No one loved Jesus more than Peter. So upon recognizing who and where Jesus was, Peter knew where he had to be. He knew what he had to do and where he had to go. When your heart, your mind, and your body truly long for the presence, the grace, and the mercy of Jesus Christ, you will go to him. That is true of all people of faith. A pulling on our hearts to step out of the boat and to submit fully to the power and freedom of Jesus Christ. And when we get to where Jesus is, you hold on tight because you don't ever want to let go. See here too Peter's faith and resolution. If you tell me to do it, I will do it. Such is the faith of all the saints. People who ask for God's will to be done and then actually go out and do it. People who, in their own way, like Peter, leave the safety of the ship and throw themselves into the jaws of death. People who choose to despise the threatening waves and demonstrate a strong dependence upon the power and word of Christ. What danger or difficulty could really stand before such a faith and such a zeal? I am blessed and humbled to have served alongside so many of those saints. And I say that because yesterday I saw people from our city walking on the water. Verses 30 and 31. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Peter was still frightened. He got out of the boat, still frightened. Please hear me, friends. Those that can say, "Lord, I believe," also say, "Lord, help my unbelief." "Lord, I am not afraid. Help me with my fear." Take special note here of how this plays out, though. What caused Peter to sink? Fear. The most repeated command in the Bible is to fear not, do not be afraid. Faith in Jesus Christ would have kept Peter above the water, but fear caused him to sink. Remember, we are saved through faith. We are kept above the waterline through faith. We are delivered by faith alone. The sinking of our city, our community, the sinking of our church, the decline of all of these things, and the general state of disarray with our country and the rest of the world is caused by fear. And if we give in to that fear, then we too, like Peter, shall sink. Can you see people sinking? Can you see our city sinking, our church, our country? Remember, Jesus had told them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." As I said, I watched our church's volunteers yesterday, and the many medical volunteers and people of faith who made God's house a triage center for the physical and emotional pain of our city. I saw them walk on the water. And as I'm sure each of these saints will verify, at the end of the day, every foot was dry. Finally, verses 32 and 33. When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Who is Jesus? Jesus is the Son of God, the Lord of all creation. Jesus is God over the storm and God in the storm. Jesus is sovereign over all creation, giving authority to all who put their faith in him, calling them to walk where he walks, to stand where he stands, and to do as he does. Jesus sends us out on our own into the storms so that we may better understand who he is. Jesus comes to us when we are in need, pulling us upward when we fall victim to fear. Jesus waits out on the water for our response, standing just beyond the sheets of rain, waiting for some of us to step out of the boat and join him in the chaos, the savagery, and the fury of this storm. Because that's where he is. That's where he has been, and that is where he will continue to be. Now, having said all that, I also need to say this. Not everyone can be like Peter. We must all step out in faith to meet Jesus in our own way. But if all of the disciples had stepped out of the boat, it would have floated away and they'd be treading water. So take note here of the relationship between Peter and the rest of the disciples. They recognize that Peter's faith is to be emulated, but that they too had a role to play and will eventually step out in faith when the time is right. And although some might have thought he was stupid, crazy, dumb, foolish, suicidal, or whatever to have stepped out of the boat, it was only through Peter's faith and then demonstration of that faith that they too got to learn more about who Jesus is. It is my hope that in the coming days, weeks, and months, as we review and discuss the egregious amount of sin that permeated our streets, that we can recognize in each other the different stages of each one's faith development, that we can build up and encourage one another in our spiritual gifts and callings, because this is a battle that is far from over. So hear me. Yesterday was not a day for everybody to be at church, for everyone to be out in the streets. Please understand me. Yesterday was not a day for everybody to be at church. If you stayed home and you prayed, good. Well done. Your prayers were felt and very much needed. We can't all get out of the boat at the same time. We're not all made for that kind of work, but we are all made to do some kind of work. And prayer is the highest level of work as demonstrated by Jesus Christ. And prayer can take on many forms. And the people who were here yesterday, they exemplified that, prayerfully discerning their tasks and positions around the church. Each of them responded to the Spirit in their own way, each of them in a constant posture of prayer while simultaneously walking across the water to Jesus on their own sea. But if you stayed home and you brooded about feeding the fire, if you're trying to make a case for how all of this was caused by statues, city councilors, counter-protesters, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, or something other than the underlying sins of fear and racism, and if you still strongly believe that the church, this church, God's house, should have been closed up, then we need to check. Because what happened here yesterday was nothing short of miraculous. And the courage and the faith of the saints of God is to be emulated. Remember, there were Nazis in our town yesterday. They're still here today, and multiple people died while defending our city from their hatred. So let me be very clear. What we saw yesterday was the full and unbridled result of racism and the complacency of a people who have been ignoring its growth, hiding behind political terms that are used to justify its continual existence. And I can now say with extraordinary certainty that God has brought me to this church at this time to work with like-minded servants to once and for all eradicate this infection from our souls. In the face of such overwhelming evil and hatred, there is no middle ground. In the presence of such an inordinate amount of sin, anger, and fear, there is but one recourse. And just to clarify further, there's no both sides to yesterday. There was only those who came to destroy, intimidate, and kill. And so there was and is only one path forward, and that path is one of overwhelming love. Yesterday, that love took the form of literally flipping over tables to protect this building and those who sought sanctuary inside. And I am thankful for the many nameless groups of men and women with masks and broom handles who found refuge in our parking lot, serving multiple times as barriers for us against trucks and guns and all kinds of evil. Although the Spirit manifested itself in them differently than it did me, we were all united yesterday in an overwhelming and inexplicable love. And as horrifying and scary as everything was yesterday, the thing that will ultimately stay with me for the rest of my life are the memories of so many good people coming together in love to ensure that the safety, the security, the physical and mental well-being of the most vulnerable and the most courageous among us was protected and honored. God is good. And on that day, on the day when Nazis and white supremacists came to our town with their guns and their cars and their bats and their pepper spray, the work of God's people was also good because so many people asked for God's ultimate will to be done and then actually went out and did it. Hundreds of people in their own way, like Peter, left the safety of the ship. They threw themselves into the jaws of death, and they chose to despise the threatening waves and demonstrated a strong dependence upon the power and the word of manifested love. And I am blessed and humbled to have served along so many amazing people who are literally responsible for the lives and well-being of countless victims. And so today, though we may now think of ourselves as safe, we are not. And neither are the most vulnerable places of our city. And in the days and weeks to come, this virus will continue to consume not only Charlottesville, but other places as well. And if the events of yesterday really surprised you, well, then you haven't been paying attention. You haven't been looking for Jesus. It is my hope and my prayer that as we regroup from this storm, that we will keep our eyes open with the full knowledge that Jesus is God over the storm and God in the storm. That Jesus is sovereign over all creation, giving authority to all who put their faith in him, calling everyone to walk where he walks, to stand where he stands, and to do as he does. Amen.